And greetings. This is such a great turnout for this particular topic, and I will be very keen to hear over the course of the next couple of hours um, what your interest is in this particular topic. My interest in this topic is going to become very clear to you quite soon as to why I think it's so important. And it'll be interesting for you just to share your ideas in the chat as we go as to what resonates with you and what your goals are for this afternoon's training. As I said, for those of you who arrived earlier, I'm Susan Wehry. I'm the Chief of Geriatrics at University of New England College of Osteopathic Medicine. I'm a geriatric psychiatrist by training, and I am an older adult. And so I have street cred across the board. I've been doing this a really long time. And one of the areas of great interest to me has been in how to preserve autonomy for people, even in the face of diminished capacity. And so that's really at the heart of what we are talking about today, because autonomy is so central to the experience of dignity, to the experience of respect, and quite frankly, to the experience of good health, both physical health and mental health. So I truly thank you all for being here with me today. And I thank you for all that you do in the care and service of or interest in older adults. So I want to start with a little poll and see who's here. Now, I will tell you that it's a long list of ways to describe yourself. And if you don't see a category that you think suits you, by all means, write it into the chat box as to what your particular role is or your interest. Who's here? Have we any people here living with dementia now? Informal care partners or family members of people living with dementia? Do we have service and support professionals or care partners? And in that category, I think of people who might work for a community-based organization like our area agencies on aging, or something in the service support, but not necessarily healthcare realm. I'm wondering if we have any physicians or advanced practice clinicians, practitioners like physician's assistants or nurse practitioners, health, ancillary care professionals, sort of all people in healthcare. That'll be social workers and nurses and OT and PT, speech therapy, rec therapy, and so forth. So any other folks who consider themselves healthcare workers? And then I'm imagining that some of you are just people interested in this topic. You may have heard about it and you are a lifelong learner and you thought, I think I'll check this out. We have also, I think, possibly some long-term care ombudsmen and some chaplains. Again, if I missed your category, please call yourself an interested person. But if there's a role you'd like us to know about, please feel free to type it in the chat box. So about 76% of you have voted. I'm going to hang on just a little longer for those absentee ballots, making sure that every voice is heard and every vote counted. And when we get up to about 90%, I will close the poll and we'll see who's here. It's a really great group. So I hope that even though we're in a large virtual group, that we'll be able to have some conversations. So you can see for yourself that we have, unfortunately, no people here living with dementia to lend their voice to our conversation, but we have some care partners, some families of people living with dementia, a number of people from the service and support sector, and a lot of people in healthcare. And I give all of you a very, very warm welcome. Now, the next poll I'd like to take is my substitute for being in a room with you. And what I mean by that is if we were all together in a room face to face, we'd be able to take the pulse of the room. I'd have an idea of kind of just how folks are doing. And so I'm going to launch another poll and ask you, as we try to create our virtual community, just tell me, how are you doing? Pick the one word that best describes your feeling right in the moment. And again, we'll just let the poll run long enough for a lot of people to vote, but I think you're kind of getting the hang of it. This poll is, the votes are getting in a little bit more quickly. You can see that we have a range of feelings because we have a range of people in the room. We have a range of emotional energy and a range of affect. So those of you who are feeling tired, which I'm sorry to see is most of us, I hope that you will leave this afternoon feeling a little less tired, maybe a little refreshed, a little nourished, at least not perhaps more tired. And then many of us are feeling grateful, happy, or contented. And a few people are feeling sad or blue. I hope also that by asking you to check in with your feelings, that you remember that you exist within a community of other people. And to the extent that it's helpful to know, to have people know how we're feeling, I hope it's helpful for you to know, whether you're happy or sad, that we're holding all those feelings in our virtual community this afternoon. So, here are my goals for this afternoon. My hope at the end of these couple of hours is that you would leave with a little better idea about your tolerance for risk, your tolerance for uncertainty, your tolerance for ambiguity, your tolerance for this gray zone in life. Because what I've learned over my many years of experience is that it is often our own biases and assumptions that really dictate how comfortable we are in tolerating risk on behalf of or in the company of other people. So this is not scientific, but it will be an opportunity for you to do some reflecting and to think, how much of my decision making is shaped by my own feeling about risk, and how much of it really is shaped by my sense of what the other person wants. At the end of this time together, you ought to be able to talk with confidence about autonomy and independence and self-efficacy, and what is different about those things, and why it is important to know. That's going to sort of take up our first hour. In the second hour, we're going to really focus in on capacity and competency. And at the end of all of this, I hope that you will be able to use what you have learned and to take away some tools, or have some tools you use validated, that you can put into the service of adults who are living with dementia. So here are some of the key concepts and why they matter. First of all, almost 90% of us on this call are human service or health professionals. And as such, we are guided by a set of ethical principles that we've all taken oaths to adhere to, and that we as professionals want to live up to. So as a physician, here are mine. Many people have heard this sort of start to the Hippocratic Oath, which is the notion that we will do no harm. And this, although we often talk about it as first do no harm, is not really a hierarchical ethical foundation. It's really one of four that are interconnected, that are interlocking, and which influence each other. But for me, one of the reasons that I am so invested in these notions of support for autonomy and for independence and self-efficacy is because it's part of my Hippocratic Oath. Another part of my Hippocratic Oath is this notion of doing good. And I'm sorry to say that doing good has kind of gotten a bad name in medicine. And I think one reason that doing good got a bad name over the course of my 40-year career is that in the early part, it was too tightly caught up in paternalism. And so that a lot of the notions that we had about do-good doctors were paternalistic. They were Father Knows Best. They were Robert Young, those of you who are old enough to recognize these pictures, and those of you who are perhaps just a little younger might even recognize Dr. Kildare. But these were the images in the 1950s and 60s of doctors, and doctors were sort of head patters. They're there, doctor knows best, I'll tell you what to do. It's not the way we practice medicine anymore, and it's a good thing that we don't, because there are other values that are also drive medical care and drive service and drive support care, and they have value as well. One of these is the notion that we have an obligation to advocate for social justice. It's not just a nice idea, we actually have an obligation to do it. And if I'm not mistaken, that is also true in the Social Work Code of Ethics, and it may be in many other ethical codes as well. And finally, we have a foundational responsibility to respect autonomy. And the focus of our conversation today is this idea of respecting autonomy, even in the face of diminished capacity. You see, it's really easy to respect autonomy when a person has the same level of capacity that we have. When we think that we reason things the same way, it's even easier to respect autonomy when people agree with us. Where it gets tricky for many people is when the person perhaps has some cognitive impairment, perhaps has some barriers to their full ability to articulate their choices. And it's in the face of that diminished capacity and in the face of people disagreeing with us, refusing treatment, not adhering to a particular, like a set of advice or something, that many people find it more difficult to respect autonomy. It's sort of like, you know, if you do the right thing, as I define it, then I will respect your choice. If you make bad choices, I won't. That's sort of what it's like. That's what is called on us here. Now, I've been using this term autonomy, and what I'd like you to do right now is to think for yourself, what's it mean? What have I been talking about? How is it different from independence? How is it similar to independence? And what is this thing called self-efficacy? And how does that relate? And please type in the chat box. Think for a moment. What is the difference among these three words? The similarities, or just some quick words as to how they're different. And another answer can be, I don't know, or they're the same. All right, well, I think you have a good handle. Most of you who wrote in have a good idea. And let me suggest to you some additional language in order to help you keep the ideas clear. When we talk about independence, we're really talking about the ability to do something on our own, by ourselves. I can do it myself. I am self-sufficient. I am self-reliant. And this is, as you know, a value that is really held so dear in our Western culture. It's particularly held dear in Maine, where people are very proud of their, and they give it extra names. I'm proud of my stubborn independence, and we're proud of our stoicism. And there is a kind of, with all due respect, a kind of over-attachment to an illusion, because none of us are truly independent. As I often say, you know, when I sit and reflect on independence, I think about the fact that I don't grow my own food, I don't make my own clothes, I didn't design my own car, I didn't get the oil out of the ground to put the gas in, and so on and so on. I didn't build my home. It'd be nice to be able to do all those things, but it is the very, very, very rare individual who is completely self-sufficient. And yet, in my family, I'm considered hyper independent. I'm considered really independent. And yet I have tremendous respect for and see myself as quite interdependent. I also feel quite interdependent because I know that human beings are highly social animals and that we actually don't survive well without one another. All of that being said, I think that it would be in our best interest if we could open up our notions a little bit about what it means to be independent and to recognize how much we rely on one another and to take as much pride in that as we take pride in our stubborn independence. Independence, though, as you know, also is a word that can simply mean freedom. And it is the freedom to be, and it is a freedom to not just do things, but do them our own way. And it's in that definition of freedom that we get a little closer to autonomy, but autonomy and independence are definitely separate concepts. Autonomy is, as many of you put into the chat box, really about choice. It is about the right to choose. It is about the right to self-determination. And here's what we often don't think about. Autonomy is also the right to be responsible. We have a right to make mistakes. We have a right to what Patricia Deegan, writing about people with serious mental illness, called the dignity of risk. You might think about it this way for yourselves. We all like to take chances, and we know that by taking some chances and by taking some risks, some of the time we're going to fail. And we learn so much more from our mistakes, right, than our successes. I know that all of you have had that experience. And yet it is often true that when we're talking about people with developmental disabilities, we're talking people with serious mental illness, and when we talk about people living with dementia, we want to take from them the dignity of risk in the spirit of protectionism, in the spirit of safety. And again, it's not that I'm suggesting that that's wrong. I'm suggesting that it has consequences and that people with dementia, people with mental illness, people with developmental disabilities deserve better. They really deserve to be treated as autonomous beings, even if they have some threats to that, even if they have some barriers to the full exercise of their autonomy. So we need to stretch ourselves a little bit and get a little bit more comfortable with the idea that autonomy belongs to all of us, and that includes the right to fail. It includes, or is based on rather, the right to privacy. Now, you notice that throughout my whole discussion of autonomy, I've been describing it as a right, because that's what it is. Self-determination, we have a lot of investment in this notion of self-determination because we know, not just for older adults, not just for people with dementia, but for all of us, that when we are in charge of our own destinies, that we actually enjoy better health. And that's both better physical health and better emotional health. We experience overall greater well-being. And those are really two good reasons to promote it. But additionally, as I've mentioned, we have a right to it, and the right to self-determination is in the law. In fact, it's embedded in the Constitution, and it's embedded in the right to privacy. And it's embedded in this notion that we have a right to be left alone. Now, that doesn't mean that we should never be our brother's keeper. That doesn't mean that we should never be aware of people who are alone, who may want assistance. But each of us has a right to be left alone. And this is one of my favorite quotes. Justice Berger said, you know, we're not just talking about the right to be left alone when you make good decisions. We're talking about protecting foolish, unreasonable, and even absurd ideas which do not conform. That's what they said in the Supreme Court about the primacy of this right to self-determination. Now, self-efficacy is a somewhat newer concept, I think, when applied to older adult health and when applied to dementia care. When I say newer, I think that self-efficacy is something we've really only begun to appreciate, I would say, in the last decade, maybe the last decade and a half. And what self-efficacy says is that, having self-determination is necessary for good health and well-being, but it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient for you to know my choices. It's not sufficient for me to articulate my choices. It's not sufficient for me to know what my choices are. What's necessary is that those choices are honored. And if I have diminished capacity, if I have a diminished ability to carry out my options on my own, that what I'm looking to others for in terms of my self-efficacy is supporting me in ways that allows me to still be in charge of my destiny, even if I can't execute it on my own. And this is why it's important to understand this difference and this tension really between independence and autonomy, because oftentimes in our culture, historically, when people have needed assistance, we have then felt as caregivers or care partners or as professionals that somehow gave us the right to make decisions for other people. And so for a long time, out of the most humanitarian kinds of impulses, we locked people up, We had people in state psychiatric hospitals. We had young people with developmental disabilities living in state institutions, because there was this idea that if you needed that much help, then you didn't get say in how you received that help. But now we know better. And so the concept of self-efficacy, which is found to be associated with much better mental health, is really this notion of being in charge. And the kind of support we want to give people is support that actually enhances that self-efficacy. As we age, for a variety of reasons, our autonomy and self-efficacy actually is threatened a little bit in our culture. And I'm going to talk with you about why and what we can do about it. You know, there are a number of normative aging issues that sometimes make it harder for us to independently carry out our own wishes. Let's just look at some of these. Sensory changes, meaning some degree of hearing loss and some degree of vision loss, may interfere with our lifestyle. Many people beyond a certain age, for some people that age is 70, for some people that age is 80, for some it's as young as 60, have a hard time driving at night. And that is simply because the nature of the change in the eye and not being able to accommodate changes in headlights coming into your eyes, right? So people begin to modify their lifestyles a little bit, maybe not to drive at night. Completely normal, kind of an annoyance, but not a major interference. Another sensory change is hearing loss. Many people over the age of 55 have measurable hearing loss, particularly people who have enjoyed in their youth really loud music, because that kind of hits the certain of the hair cells in the ear in a way that makes it hard to hear conversation. In the face of that, people may withdraw because they're only catching part of a conversation, or may not want to watch television, or to the annoyance of the whole family may want to watch television with it up really loudly. These are just changes. And so when we have these kind of disruptions in the who of we are, sort of biological, then it begins to have an impact on our sense of self. We'll tuck that away. Also know that biologically, as we get older, our physiologic reserve fluctuates quite a bit and begins to get reduced. Translation of that is simply that if you get sick, it's going to be a little harder to bounce back and get well. And so the amount of stress of a particular kind, particularly illness, can be recovered from, but it's going to take a little bit longer, and each time it takes a little bit more toll. And then those of you who are in the healthcare professions, and that's many of you, know that with aging comes increased sensitivity to particular medications and increased sensitivity to the side effects of most medications. So biologically, there are some real changes that can cause people to feel a little unsettled until they integrate those biological changes. Mm-hmm. The other normative aging issues have to do with our cognition. As we age, our capacity, or our memory efficiency is what I really should say, decreases. And it starts happening at about age 35. We think of it as a gray hair wrinkles phenomenon. We think about it when we start looking old and feeling old, but actually that decline in efficient memory function, short-term memory, happens at a much earlier age. What it means as a practical matter, that as we get older and we want to learn something, we'll have to practice more. We'll have to have more trials. We'll have to have more repetitions. But our overall capacity for new learning remains relatively unchanged. However, in a world that is built around notions of efficiency and speed, if you don't learn fast, then people say you don't learn. And so it's really important for all of us to appreciate that that's actually not the case with the old brain. The older brain can learn, will learn, give it time, and it can function just fine. The other impact on cognition from an aging perspective, a normal aging perspective, is this notion of sensory impairment. So if you're missing some of the words, It's harder to pay attention. You may not register accurate information. And so there's this relationship between sensory impairment and cognitive impairment. Again, totally normal, not a precursor of dementia, not a heralder of anything except some change to the sense of self. Now, psychologically, what's really interesting to me is that as we get older, we actually get better. We actually experience more in the way of positive emotions. We actually are able, much better than youth, to deal with something like this current pandemic in a way that does this constant reappraisal. Yes, this social isolation is lousy. And, it's given me an opportunity to clean my closets. And it's given me an opportunity to spend time with my family. We'll get by. Yes, there is a lot of heartache and sadness and tragedy, and I don't deny it. And I can also scan the horizon for beauty and hope and still experience joy. That's actually the way older people, in a recent study that was done, are getting through this pandemic. And yet the public narrative is, what are we going to do about those poor, vulnerable older adults? Now, this is not to criticize my colleagues or to criticize myself in our efforts to address social isolation. We absolutely must. But my point is this: older adults, when you just study us, are actually psychologically in a little better shape. We get better with age. We actually have some coping strategies that young people don't have, a big one being life experience. This isn't our first hardship. This is our first pandemic. I guess some of us might have been alive in 1918, but this is our first really big pandemic. And so it's not that we've done this before, but we've done a lot before. We've done 9/11. We've done Katrina. Some of us have done SARS. And so these life experience opportunities have actually made the current generation of folks over 70 a little bit more resilient. The other truth of late life, though, is that you experience a lot of loss. And the healthier you are, the more loss you will experience. Because if you are the healthy member of your tribe and of your friend circle, you will bury a lot of people. You will bury brothers and sisters. You'll bury parents. You'll bury friends. And so the healthier you are and the more longevity you have, then the more opportunities you will have to experience and to deal with loss, which can be an opportunity not just for sadness, though it is, but also for further growth. And so late life in a normative way is a very active time from a developmental perspective of how much more psychological health we can achieve. And it's also true that goals and values may change over a lifetime as older adults know themselves and know what is important to them. And they also are better able to discard what is not important. Finally, from a normative standpoint, older adults experience a tremendous change in their role and sometimes in society in the extent to which they feel valued. One of the things that older adults often talk about, and I now newly experience this myself, is this experience of invisibility. People just don't feel seen in a place like a restaurant or in a place like on the street, in a social setting. Older people truly do become less visible. And then finally, older adults are seen as easier targets for exploitation and for abuse. So there's a lot going on in old age. In addition to all of those normative factors that are going on across the lifespan, we also have a number of non-normative issues, which have a tremendous impact on autonomy and on self-efficacy. And I refer here to serious mental illness, to dementia, to be sure, to depression, to substance use disorders, and then, as I say, this susceptibility or this increased risk to abuse, neglect, and exploitation. The net result of this, frankly, is that a lot of older adults really live in fear of losing their autonomy. as they see themselves as having less agency or as having less effectiveness in society or less ability, they worry that. And they have reason to worry, frankly, that their adult children, that their friends, their well intentioned doctors will start trying to make decisions for them. Older adults also live in fear, quite frankly, that if they don't go along with their adult children's wishes, that there will be some reprisals, some loss of affection. And what I find is that many families have a really hard time negotiating this phase of life when the younger but adult child sees their older parent as less able in a way that is unsettling to them. It may not be as unsettling to their parent, but adult children have a hard time catching up to the notion that their parents are mortal, and that they're not invincible. And so sometimes that unease gets transferred to their parent, and the parent, the older adult parent, really fears losing the child's affection. And so there's this temptation to kind of go along with what they want. The other effect of either a normative change or certainly the onset of something like dementia due to Alzheimer's disease does for many people create a situation and they feel like they are losing their options. And so it can be a very stressful time of life. As a result, also, you may have noticed that older adults get a little bit more anxious when somebody challenges their decisions. They get a little bit more defensive. They get a little bit more stubborn in a way that may not even serve their best interest in their own eyes, not best interest what I think they are, but people will often say that what they really want, for example, is to stay in their home. But in order to stay in their home, they may have to accept a little bit of assistance. When I say may have to, in order to simply eat, they may need to accept that meals are delivered. And they might agree they want to eat, but they don't agree that they want somebody coming and bringing them food, because even that is a little bit too much of an intrusion. So one of our jobs really is, particularly for people living with dementia, is to help the person that we're serving understand that actually we're very much on their side, that they have nothing to fear from us, that our goal is not to take over their decision making. Our goal is to see how we can figure out how to let them stay in their driver's seat for, for as long as they wish to. And I think this is one of the conversations that I most often have with adult children. They'll usually consult me saying, can you get my mom to see that she really needs, and then fill in the blank, needs to go to assisted living, needs more help, needs home health care, needs whatever. And I often turn it around kind of in a lighthearted way to say, well, I can try that, but what I really want to know is, what's it going to take for me to convince you she doesn't? Because oftentimes adult children really see a danger and a need where none exists. And again, I think that it's out of the most honorable of intentions and of affect, and it results from, I think, a fundamental inability to see their aging parent in a new way, as maybe not invincible anymore if they looked up to them in that way as a child, but still perfectly functional and capable. Now, I want to tell you a story that kind of captures all of this, a story about Eleanor. Eleanor's an 88-year-old woman, widowed about a year, living independently in her apartment. And a neighbor contacted her daughter saying, you know, I'm worried about your mother. She used to come out all the time to pick up the mail or pick up the newspaper, go down to the store, whatever. I didn't expect to see her much during COVID, but I'm seeing her even less now than before, and I'm worried about her. The other day, when I was walking past her apartment door, I just kind of happened to look inside, and she looked quite disheveled, and her apartment seemed kind of a mess. I think you need to do something. Now, COVID has made everything really tricky, except for the daughter who already lived in California and was never visiting her mother face to face. So, for people who don't live near their parents, that sort of like go to the home isn't really an option anyway.
Mhm.
So the daughter checks in with Eleanor, right? And says, what's going on, Mom? And tries to figure out what's happening. And her mother says repeatedly, there is nothing for you to worry about. But the daughter notices that Mom really isn't speaking as clearly, seems to be a little bit confused. And she too begins to worry about what she ought to do. So she calls the doctor. She calls other people that she knows to be involved in her mother's life. And immediately, the team that's looking in on Eleanor on the daughter's behalf says, "We went to see your mother. We all had our masks on. She opened the door for us, and it was total squalor. We know your mother. She doesn't usually live like this. We think you need to become her guardian." Just like that. We think you need to become her guardian, make decisions for her. We offered to have somebody clean her apartment. We offered to have her go stay with somebody, whatever offer was made, and she refused. And her refusal was all that it took to trigger and ask that the daughter become the guardian, her legal decision maker, so that she could make her do things that were in her best interest. Because people were unable to persuade Eleanor that, yeah, she maybe did need some help. Fortunately, the neighbor, once Eleanor, once Eleanor's situation was a little bit more clarified, was able to have a conversation with her to at least persuade her to go to the doctor. Well, the upshot of this story, and I won't drag it out, is that Eleanor was suffering from a clinically significant depression, which she had suffered from before, and did have significant cognitive decline. But what she had was dementia due to depression. It's absolutely true that on her screening test for dementia, she screened positive for dementia. It's absolutely true that on her MOCA, she had a score in the dementia range. And it's absolutely true that the healthcare members of the team said, well, it looks like she does need to have a guardian because she has dementia. Gratefully, enough people on the team, including the out of town daughter, were able to say, couldn't we wait to see what happens when the dementia clears? I mean, when the depression clears, and see what happens to her dementia. And indeed, her depression was treated, her depression did clear, her dementia did clear, and she was able to remain in her own home. Now, I tell that story, one, because it has a happy ending, but mainly because I want to underscore the importance of not jumping to conclusions when you see somebody with diminished capacity, when you see somebody with impaired decision making. There's no question but that Eleanor had been living in a way that was having a very negative effect on her health. She had lost a lot of weight. The more weight she lost and the more muscle tone she lost, the greater risk she was for falls. She wasn't eating, she was not hydrated, and she was confused. No denying any of that. The point is that often becomes a reason that people want to take over decision making, when what it ought to become is a reason for further investigation. And a reason, the goal here is, what will it take to restore Eleanor's capacity for decision making? Not to use her current state as a reason to take it away. Now, I have seen my share of bad kids. I've seen my share of adult children who exploit their elders. I've seen my share of people who, just are itching to get their inheritance. But I'm telling you, that stuff is mostly the exception and not the rule. In my experience, adult children do act out of filial love. They really do simply fear that some bad thing is going to happen to mom or dad. And that bad thing is going to be that they're exploited, they're going to have a fall. And so I think the motivation, these triggers, are actually not unreasonable and not hard to understand. Understanding them, though, and finding them reasonable is not the same thing as supporting them to their conclusion of, I now have to intervene with mom. It is, however, important to understand so that we can address the concerns of adult children with the same kind of compassionate curiosity and the same kind of support that we do for the older adults that we want to protect. Most of the time, when people get pushy, and that about trying to take over decision making for an older adult with diminished capacity, it's either driven by some safety fear, and that safety is usually about a fall or risk of exploitation, or that they're simply experiencing too much decline, physical decline. There's some well-known points when that happens. Transitions of care is a very popular time. There are people, I fear, that are still in hospital because the hospital discharge team doubts their capacity to care for themselves at home. And the person who wants to go home isn't able always to accept the kind of help they need in their home to be able to go home. And they get into this stalemate because of this, I think, rigidity on the part of the older person sometime, because they're afraid of losing options if they accept help. And on the other hand, the fear on the part of the team that something untoward will befall them and that they will somehow be responsible. So people get locked into these stalemates because there's I think, a lot of fear, frankly, on both sides of that equation. Now, all of what I've said has always been true, frankly, across my career. When I say it's been true, the pressures to take over decision making, the kinds of normative changes, the kind of non-normative changes in late life. But right now, we're facing an even bigger push, I think, as this pandemic has really shown such a bright spotlight on the number of people who are, in fact, living in isolation or experiencing social isolation, and the number of people, some number of them, who are increasingly feeling lonely. And the pandemic has really, again, shown a very bright spotlight on the great digital divide as we talk about it. And that digital divide, of course, refers to the fact that rural Maine doesn't have broadband. It refers to the fact that even in those places where we have broadband, not all older adults have access to digital technology. And those who have access to it may not know how to use it. And those who want to learn how to use it may not have access to tutors. They may not have anybody who can show them how to use it. Fortunately, in Maine, the good part of the story is that we have been the recipient of a lot of CARE Act dollars, and we have a wonderful organization or a wonderful center, the National Digital Equity Center, which has as its mission to try to close this great digital divide for people who are disenfranchised. And that would be people who are poorer, low-income people. That would be people who live in rural areas. That would be older adults who haven't used, or don't know how to use, and may not want to know how to use digital technology, but may find themselves left out of a lot of services if they don't learn how. And so the pandemic has really pushed that digital edge in a big way. It is also, because of the enormous stress that everybody's been under, has also led to an increase in substance use disorders as people use inadequate coping strategies, but strategies they've used before to deal with the stress. So it's really incumbent on those of us in the in the health and human service fields, I think, to have a clear idea of the nature of the problem in the pandemic recovery phase, and then how to be supportive of people in a way that doesn't try to take over or try to limit their autonomy. Because there is a big push coming to limit autonomy for older adults. And that is because it's estimated that over 5 million people over the age of 65 are victims of elder abuse each year. And this may be through fraud scams, this may be through physical abuse or through neglect. but it's a very sobering and it's a staggering number. And when we see that, we want to do something. I worry that the thing that we want to do is to build in more protections for older adults rather than to empower older adults to be better able to deal with the risks of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And I say that because before coming to Maine, I lived and worked in the state of Vermont. And in Vermont, one of my colleagues introduced or got a legislator to introduce a bill that would require older adults to undergo capacity assessments when they wanted to enter into contracts. Now, this came about after Hurricane Irene. And after Hurricane Irene, we had a great deal of flooding throughout the state of Vermont. I was working in state government at the time. And I got to tell you that for all the heroism and for all the good things that happen in a disaster, fraudsters are like right behind the do-gooders, right behind community people rebuilding, come people who, write contracts for home repairs that never get done, charge inordinate amounts of money, scam people, defraud people. It happens. Okay, I'm not naive about that. And there is this idea that older people are too trusting, that they are more trusting, that they are not sufficiently mistrustful of their fellow man, and so they're easier to scam. And they point to that finding that I told you about earlier, that in fact, older adults do tend to see the world more positively. So I had this colleague who put 2 and 2 together and got 70 and said, we need to protect people because their brains are less efficient, they're too trusting, and they have their emotional lives are too positive. They expect the best. And so before they can sign a contract, I can't even remember all of the absurdity of the bill. It didn't go anywhere, but it was such an eye-opener to me, how the best of intentions are so ill-advised. And so I say why this all matters so much more now is that we're entering a new phase of our pandemic experience together. We're about to enter the recovery phase together. And when I say about to, I mean like next fall, when we're all vaccinated, when the variants are kind of subdued a little bit, when we have a better handle on the lessons that we have learned from this COVID-19 pandemic, when we've had a year of a different kind of functional government, then we are going to have some opportunities, I think, and some pressures to look at what we have learned about how people with dementia have fared during this pandemic, and to look at the scams that are going to proliferate. So we want to be mindful of them. We want to be attentive to the risk of elder abuse. But rather than moving towards protectionism in our culture of safetyism, what we want to do is move to empowering people, even people who have diminished capacity. Okay? Because what I'm seeing and what I'm seeing nationwide, I actually don't know about the data in Maine, but there has been an increased demand for guardianships around the country in the last 5 years, even after we had a nice period about 10 years ago of a lot of guardianship reform and people finding alternatives to it. So we're in a really interesting place right now, I think, culturally, and something that we want to be really mindful of and begin to address in Maine. So there are real risks. I understand that people want to take control of people who have diminished capacity and look after them, but it really does give us a false sense of security. And even when people want to temporarily take over decision making, it inevitably leads to permanent labeling. So even people say it's just a temporary guardian. That, having had that label, does label you for a very long time. So we need to think, and we're going to in the second hour, think more creatively about alternatives to supporting people and preserving their autonomy. I also think that one of the reasons that I so resist the whole guardianship effort is that it pretends to solve the problem. It diverts the attention away from the harder issues of how do we support people living in community? How do we support people living at home? You know, the problem with taking control of other people is that it really does divert us, as I was saying, from our attention to the harder issues of what kind of opportunities do we want to have available for people living with dementia as their dementia progresses and as they're living with dementia for 12, 15 years. Full lives, thriving lives, okay? So we don't want to make decisions that lead us down that path of placing people, putting people, doing to people, because when we impact a person's self-efficacy, predictably, they experience cognitive decline and worse physical health. So we want to do that. And these are some of the risks. And then, of course, there are also exploitative guardians, or exploitative guardians, I guess you would say. And even well-intentioned, not all children are well-intentioned. And so even when the guardian is a family member, there is no guarantee that that person will seek to act on behalf of the person, will seek to use substitute judgment, will seek to exercise the will of the person for whom they're guardian, as the Maine law requires. More often than not, they fall into this headset of a best interest, like they know what's better. And actually, your law, like Vermont's law, our law here, requires that we follow a substituted judgment standard. How do we find our way out of this, and how do we support people differently? Well, this is where I would like to suggest that we turn to the wisdom traditions and that we really take a second look at the notion of compassion. Now, I think about compassion as empathy plus right action. And what I mean by that is when we are empathic, when we stand in the other person's shoes, when we have the capacity and take the time to bother with the perspective of others, we are displaying empathy, and it's a feeling, and it's a good feeling, and it's a great capacity for humans to have. But compassion actually enters in when not only do I recognize the distress, but I have a wish to do something about it on your terms. Because when we are empathic with the person who is threatened with their autonomy, their greatest fear is losing that. And so our compassionate action is to recognize that that is their greatest fear, losing their self-determination, losing agency. And we stand with them in that. I mean, the word compassion literally means being together in suffering. And so when we empathize, not sympathize, but when we empathize with that condition, then taking a compassionate approach says, I get it. I get how important your autonomy is to you. And I stand with you, not in just protecting you, keeping people from taking it. I stand with you in figuring out how to help you exercise it. That's really what our task is. Now, I got to tell you, this took me a lot of years to learn. In the early part of my career, I thought compassion meant I fought tooth and nail to protect everybody's autonomy. Okay, so I fought, if you will, to keep people from having guardianships. What I've learned, and I still do, but what I learned now is that what's really important is not just that I'm fighting all the time, but what's really important is that I'm standing on the side of the person, truly empathically, and saying, how are we going to support your autonomy, not how am I going to protect you from others? Now, it might sound like not a very big distinction, and I don't think it's a very big distinction in terms of my actions, but I can tell you it's a very big distinction in terms of how I experience this. In order to really use compassion and use compassionate curiosity to understand family as well as understand the older adult, we really do use empathy and not sympathy. We empathize with the fear that both parties have. We empathize with the fear that families have, that doctors have, that nurses have, that everybody who's afraid on behalf of the other person. We get it. And we understand how afraid the person living with dementia is of losing their autonomy. And we understand the sense of loss. We empathize with that. And we also understand and empathize with the dignity of risk, that we get more comfortable with the notion that risks are worth taking and harm can sometimes result. And so our task may sometimes be to minimize harm, not try to avoid any harm at all. This is really what I think is called for in compassionate action as an alternative to taking control of people and yet not leaving them to their own devices. I think the other unfortunate development in some ways has been this just kind of blind support for autonomy. This, well, that's what they want, that's what they want, that's what they want. And part of me understands that simplistic way of saying, yep, autonomy trumps everything. But I also have to do good, advocate for social justice, and do no harm. So I have to have a little bit more nuanced approach to trying to support self-efficacy. So I guess the simple message here, and then we're going to take a break, is that your job, my job, our job, is to try to find balance among all of these competing demands. Our desire to protect without interfering with autonomy, our desire to see that people have the basics of food, shelter, and clothing, even when they seem unable to get them for themselves or to seem to reject them. That in fact, the basics, I do believe that people would rather be fed than hungry. I do believe that people would rather be warm than cold. And when they say they don't want those things, I believe it is because they don't want the strings that are attached. And so we need to find a way to balance support for our fellow man without saying that we get to take over from our fellow man. And this is all about enhancing self-efficacy. So here's how you do it. And this, I think I think most of you in the various professions probably already do this. One thing we do is to individualize all of our support, that our care plans, our support plans, our service plans are driven by the individual's values and by their strengths, not just by their deficits. From a healthcare standpoint, we're part of the whole age-friendly movement here in Maine with our Geriatric Workforce Enhancement Project. And we're trying to transform primary care to say, you know, if you want to take good care of your older adults, ask them what matters most to them. And this whole movement is known as paying attention to the 4 M's. So we identify health goals based on what matters most to the older adult. We also support self-efficacy by creating control, or control points as I call them, in any interaction that we have in the service industry or the healthcare industry. And that means quite simply, if you're doing home visits, that you, to the extent possible, let the person dictate when it is that you come. You let the person dictate how it is that you spend your time. And that when you present options for care, for service, for support, that you do so clearly, realistically, in plain language, and you repeat it as many times as the person needs to hear it, so you're sure that they understand it. And you provide all that without any personal bias. All of these intentional ways of giving control back to the other person so that their wish determines our schedule, not the other way around, within reason. Obviously, if 2 people want to see at the same time on the same day, you can't do it. So you say that. So you give realistic choices, and you don't give choices that you have no intention of fulfilling. So you give realistic ones, you let people know your limits, but you present the plan with the intention of giving the person as much control as possible. Every single thing you do with an older adult is an opportunity to enhance their self-efficacy, to design partnerships in a way that they call the shots. No matter what it is, whether you're coordinating care or working on self-management, it is all in the service of saying, What do you think we ought to do here? And here's how I can help you carry that out. Finally, those of us who are in the helping professions, I think, have a tendency to give ourselves a little bit too much credit for how important we are in older people's lives. Now, what I mean by that is simply this: most older adults do have other people besides us in their lives. And that's not always true. Sometimes we're all they've got. But more often than not, I got to tell you, I think we don't work hard enough to engage circles of support, to engage other people, be they friends or former coworkers or current coworkers. And one big area where we have really fallen short, I think, is in helping people living with dementia to identify peers. Now, it's been my great privilege, actually, since the pandemic began, to meet every week with a group of people living with dementia who are themselves dementia mentors. And so they're part of an international organization known as Dementia Mentors. And when a person has been diagnosed with dementia, they often find their way to the Dementia Action Alliance, where these mentors can be found. And so these are peers. And so I'm along sort of for the ride. I'm along to facilitate our conversations. But these are 12, 14 people who every week to support one another. And I think that the other great opportunity that the pandemic has created for us is to make us a little less ageographic, by which I mean that in our dementia peer support group, we have people from coast to coast in the United States and also two people from Canada who come regularly. And it no longer matters that we're not down the road. They've all mastered Zoom. Only two people in our call need their care partner to set up the call. Everybody else learned it eventually over time. And so when we think about peers, particularly thinking about people living with dementia, please think about dementia mentors who are available by searching online and engaging others in this support for self-efficacy. Finally, we can always turn to advanced care planning as another domain in which people can exercise their autonomy. We need to get more comfortable, I think, with having the conversation about advanced care plans. And one project going on in a lot of our area agencies on aging uses the Conversation Project, which you can also find online. And this is a way of having a conversation with families, a way of having a conversation with older adults about what they're thinking about end of life care, what they think that they might like to have, teaching them about palliative care, and often starting with the 5 questions. And if you don't know what the 5 questions are, Google it or read Atal Gawande's book, Being Mortal. All right, your key takeaways from this hour: find the balance and nurture self-efficacy. Okay? We want to be able to lead with compassion and not control. There were a couple of questions that came up that I wanted to answer for the whole group. One of the questions was about this notion of substituted judgment and what did I mean by that? And so what I wanted to explain to you is that it used to be when somebody had a guardian appointed, that the responsibility of that guardian was to act in what they, the guardian, thought was the best interest of the other person, who is typically referred to as a ward. And so from a legal standpoint, understand that when somebody has a guardian, it renders that ward, that older adult, that person, with having the rights of about a 6-year-old. So in the late 80s, and then again, a repeat of it in the early aughts, there was a lot of guardianship, the big guardianship reform movement underway to say that if a guardian were appointed, they were obligated to use what's called the substituted judgment standard, as opposed to the best interest standard. So in other words, instead of saying, I think this is what's best for you, I have to ask you, what do you think is best for you? And I have to act on your behalf as you would have acted if you still were deemed competent. Okay, so a guardian is now required to consult with the ward and to do their best to find out what the person would have wanted them to do even if it's not what the guardian thinks ought to be done. And that's in the law. And I was saying that I know in Vermont, you have a prescriptive requirement. The law requires guardians to consult. In Maine, I don't know if it's a requirement, but it is a recommendation. So that's what substituted judgment is. The next thing that I wanted to ask about, asked Jennifer McCauley to talk about, was what she is seeing in her continuous care community about fraud scams and what they are trying to do to address it. Jennifer?
Thanks. So I am a what's called a health and wellness navigator. I'm a social worker, basically a case manager at a life care community. So we have independent living, assisted living, and memory care. And our leadership team has noticed an uptick in the number of scam attempts at our residents, particularly in independent living. So a lot of email phishing scams and kind of more pesky phone calls. I think we've dealt with this in the past. We tend to be a target because we're so obviously a senior community. And I think that it may be that our email system may have gotten hacked too. So the organization itself was targeted, and so now staff members have to be actually extra careful too. So we've had that issue as well. So we're actually doing a repeat workshop. We're bringing back a local bank executive and a police detective to come in and give another talk about how to keep yourself safe from email and phone scams. And junk mail's been an issue too, more of a volume problem, but some of those things that they get are also a little sketchy, like send money for this cause. And so we also provided information in our newsletter about how to stop junk mail from coming to your mailbox, because we can't do it as a facility. Each individual person has to address that with the post office themselves. So we're just trying to raise awareness amongst our population, and they're actually fairly savvy, but just as you were saying in the break, Susan, these scammers are pretty sophisticated and they tend to up their game. And, if you're not looking carefully at an email or an email address or a logo, you can get fooled if you're not being extra careful.
Great. Thank you very much. And, that reminds me that in a lot of communities, banks are willing to provide those kind of talks all the time. So the rest, if any of others of you work in that space, then I would encourage you to make this one of those empowerment evenings, one of those educations for the older adults that live there. And I would encourage participation in some fashion by those who are living with dementia and or their care partners. And so one of the things I'd like to ask you to reflect on, and I'm just going to start a poll to do this, is how you see yourself with respect to taking risks. And we're going to use the idea of driving your car and going on a trip to be a little window into how you think about yourself as a risk taker. So when I launch the poll, I would like you just to describe whether you prefer to drive in the left-hand lane, also known as the passing or fast lane when you go on a journey. Do you prefer the middle lane, or do you like the right-hand lane, slow and easy? So just which lane do you prefer? Totally anonymous, just curious about, I'm curious, but I also want you to be curious about how you experience risk. We have about 25 people, or about 22% of attendees, prefer that left lane or fast drivers, and there's a certain level of risk with that. And there's certain people who prefer the right lane, a smaller number, only about 10%, and there's a certain risk with that. And a different kind of risk, driving in the middle, where 68% of us prefer to drive. Now, here's another poll for you to take. Again, not so much because it's scientific, but because it's interesting, I think, for you to just reflect about your attitude towards risk. And here's this one. I want you to imagine that it's the final round of Jeopardy! Some of you may not know about the game show Jeopardy, but here's what you need to know. On the game show Jeopardy, 3 contestants compete by answering a lot of trivia questions, and they get to select categories in which they feel that they're strong, and they win some money over the course of about a half-hour program, I think. In the final round of this game, they all have a certain amount of money, presuming that they have answered that they've answered some questions right, and that they've been first to answer them. So here's what I want you to picture. And then when you get to the final round, what happens is that you get an opportunity to bet on the winnings that you have, or to make a wager as to whether or not you're going to know the answer to the final question. The way it plays is that you have an opportunity to end up in first place or last place, depending on how the other two do, and depending on how much of your winnings you wager. So here's the question. It's the final round of Jeopardy. You have $5,000. You have an option of going for broke, betting your whole $5,000. And if the other 2 people don't know the answer, or if only one of them does, or they don't bet their money, lots of contingencies here. But just suffice it to say that you have a chance of going into first place if you go for broke and bet the whole thing. You also have the option of holding on to your winnings. You won't be back the next night. You're already in third place. There's nothing that can be done about that. But you can go home with $5,000. Or you can hedge your bet somewhere in the middle, wager half of it, and go home with the other half, or maybe double your winnings. So, how do you play? Do you go for broke? Do you hold on to your winnings, or do you hedge your bet? All right, the usual number have voted. And so here's how our community looks on the hedging your bets, or how you wager. Again, this is only intended to say, think about it. How do you take chances using that little poll to do it? Okay. So the concepts that I wanted to really get from this part of our training this afternoon is the difference between competency and capacity. You will hear these terms often used interchangeably, but here's the easiest way to keep it straight. Competency is a legal concept. We are all competent until a judge says we're not. Competency is determined in probate court. And again, like innocence, you're assumed to have it until somebody takes it away. So you can't, just because somebody has dementia, start calling them incompetent to make a particular decision. Only a judge can do that. On the other hand, the idea of capacity is a clinical concept, and capacity always refers to the ability to do something, okay? Now, it's important to keep these straight, and I got to tell you, a lot of doctors don't, a lot of lawyers don't, but the reason that I kind of harp on it is that competency is an all or nothing kind of issue, right? You're either competent or a judge says you're not. And once a judge says you're not, you're rendered a 6-year-old. Capacity, on the other hand, is a little bit different, is a lot different. You can have capacity in one area and not have capacity in another. In other words, capacity is very task specific. You may have the capacity to make a decision about a medical procedure. You may have capacity to make a decision about where you're going to live, but you may not have capacity for financial decision making. You may not have, particularly if you have dementia and have frontal lobe involvement, you may not have the capacity to actually do simple arithmetic or to make financial judgments. So you might need some assistance in that area, in that task, but you don't need somebody to make decisions for you about where you're going to live, or somebody to make decisions for you about your medical decisions, or you may. In other words, capacity is contextual, it is task specific, it can fluctuate. And when we're trying to determine capacity in people with complex impairments, it frankly can be kind of difficult. The primary elements of capacity basically are these. A person, to demonstrate the ability to make a decision, needs to have some awareness of his or her environment, has to be able to process information, has to be able to make some decisions, and to exercise adequate judgment. And what you will see is missing here is the person has to have memory. You don't actually have to have much in the way of memory skills to demonstrate capacity. You can, if you are given information in ways that is accommodating of your dementia, process each step along the way and arrive at a decision, even if you can't remember what you have just been through. Now, the astute assessor will then repeat that capacity evaluation multiple times to determine that it wasn't just chance how the person reasoned it. And I've done many of these where the person has repeatedly said what they want to have happen in a particular situation. No matter how I ask it or how we reason it, the outcome is always the same. And yet, the outcome that the person doesn't remember is also the same. And so it can be very challenging, I think, to families. It's very challenging, I can tell you, to the court, to appreciate that a person can have all of these elements of capacity, even in the face of memory loss. But it is quite possible. What capacity really requires us to entertain is, what decision is it that needs to be made here? And what's interfering with the person's ability to make that decision? And is that capacity likely to change? We all know that people living with dementia, when they become ill with something else, be it a urinary tract infection, a cold, or just having had a sleepless night, or having adverse medication reactions, may not on a given day be able to make certain decisions. But when that acute confusional state that is superimposed on their dementia is treated, it clears up, so to speak, and they're just with their baseline dementia, they may in fact may be able to make decisions that they weren't able to make at a particular point in time. And any judge worth his or her position on the bench should know this. And yet, I have to tell you that many of them do not. There is a real lack of appreciation, I think, in the judiciary and to some extent among clinicians as well, that capacity has this fluctuating quality. And it's incumbent on us to have people do their best, not try to find them doing their worst, because we want, as our guiding principle, to be able to preserve autonomy for as long as we can and in as many ways as we can. And then finally, with capacity, one of the things that the courts always ask is whether or not the assessor or family members are exerting any undue influence in a particular decision that needs to be made, and whether or not the person has the capacity, the ability to recognize that influence, whether or not they recognize that their decisions are in fact voluntary and that their decisions are up to them, that they do have some choice. So remember, I said capacity is task specific. And for those of you who do a lot of direct work with older adults, this is, I think, really important for you to understand that we have this category of decision-making ability that we just call everyday decision-making ability. And in that regard, a person, in order to be able to demonstrate capacity, needs to show that they have the capacity to live alone, as evidenced by knowing what to do in an emergency, as evidenced by knowing how to get the water turned on if it is turned off, knowing whom to call when they've run out of fuel or whatever it is. In other words, people don't have to be able to do things for themselves. This isn't independence. They need to know how to get them done. Everyday decision-making as a separate category is around managing medication, around managing finances. And then, of course, it can be the most challenging, and that is the capacity to drive a car. And one of you shared with us in the chat box that this was something that your father had to face. And in our automobile culture and lack of public transportation culture, losing the ability to drive is losing a lot. Another type of capacity is the capacity to consent to treatment. Usually here we're talking about medical treatment. And of course, to consent to treatment, a person simply has to be able to know and to show that they know that you're offering a treatment, that there's something that there is an idea on the table, a treatment plan on the table, and that it's being recommended as opposed to some other kind of treatment, some other kind of option. So they need to know that they have options, that there are options. They need to know the benefits of the various options, the risks of the various options. And then finally, they need to know that actually the choice is theirs, that it's voluntary and it's up to them. Testamentary capacity is a fascinating capacity, and I don't know that we'll have time to get into it very much, but testamentary capacity is simply the capacity to make a will. And it's very different than all these other capacities. To make a will, you only have to be able to do two things. I think the law is so interesting. You have to be able to show that you know your natural heirs. You know that if you die intestate, that means without a will, who the court would consider your natural heir. So if you're a parent, that usually means a child or maybe a spouse. And if you die without a will, you need to know who would get your stuff. That's one thing you have to show. And the other thing the law says is that if you want to make your own will, you have to know what you're worth. So the extent of your bounty. And this is very interesting. It's a pretty low bar, actually, for making your own will. But a person with dementia who can identify their heirs and has some idea of their largesse has capacity to make a will, and their wishes need to be honored, whether people think that there is a scoundrel involved or not. And then, of course, research consent and conjugal visits are additional types of capacity that we are sometimes called on to assess. I've alluded to these, but you'll have them in your slide deck. Basically, the key aspects of decisional capacity have to do with understanding what's going on, appreciating whether or not you have any limitations that would interfere with your ability to carry something out, showing some reason. Doesn't have to be a good reason, it just has to be a more or less logical reason, and that you can explain the choice that you're making, and then to express the choice that you're making. What's critically important for you to understand about capacity is that it has a lot more to do with your functional ability to do something than with a diagnosis. In other words, it's the capacity is really about the ability to maintain your hygiene, maintain your diet, not do it on your own, but to see that you get it. Same way with performing certain financial activities. It's really about, it's in the doing, not in the having a diagnosis that might be impacting that particular brain function. So if you are faced with these decisions, what I encourage people to think about are these two broad categories. Faced with a decision, it's important to know, if you want to assist a person in supporting decision-making, that you do have an understanding of the nature and extent of the impairments. In other words, we don't try to support a person's decision-making by asking them to remember a lot of things if memory is their problem. We don't ask a person who has sequencing problems to take all the necessary steps. We do ask a person with sequencing problems to understand it when we line those steps up for them, and that they can follow those steps even if they can't create them. So you identify residual strengths, you look at the nature and extent of the impairment, and you put those things together and say, what kind of workaround could this person living with dementia use to be able to keep making their own decisions? And probably the easiest example here, and again, all the folks in my discussion group use all kinds of memory aids because that's what most of them, that's where their biggest impairment is in remembering. So they have learned to use a lot of digital and non-digital tools to support that aspect of their cognitive function, but their reasoning ability remains at this point quite intact. So they can figure things out, they can solve problems, they can use tools at their disposal. Not all people living with dementia can. And that's what I mean about finding out what people can do. What if you were going to find a workaround they could do, and what makes it hard for them to do things just strictly on their own. So if you are, in a situation where people are asking your opinion about whether you think somebody is competent, it's now kind of up to you to say to the person, I'm not sure that's the right question. Only a judge can say they're competent. But what decision is it that you think they need to make? What decision are they faced with here? What choices are they faced with? Let's figure out, do they have the capacity to make this particular decision? Do they have the capacity and the willingness to use adaptive equipment if that is what is necessary for them to maintain their independence, for example? So my hope would be that, not to make you all assessors, obviously, but rather to have you clear about how to ask the questions when somebody has dementia and has some diminished capacity. Pearl's a 79-year-old woman, mother of 5 children, who had had a long history of alcohol abuse and a current history of dementia due to vascular disease. She was living with a young man, as she had had for many years off and on, who was clearly financially exploiting her. He was not the first young man who lived with her to financially exploit her, and she did not mind being financially exploited. She greatly enjoyed the company of young men. After a stroke, her family wanted to obtain a guardian for her to protect her from this exploitative young man to whom she was going to be going. They lived together, and so she was going back to the home. 2 of the children wanted to get a guardian. A judge was willing to give a guardian. 3 of the children said, that seems like a pretty heavy-handed approach. And yes, it's true that he's exploiting her, but after all, it's her money. The other children said, yes, it's her money, but who do you think is going to have to take care of her when she runs out of money? It's going to be us. So we need to figure out a way to protect her assets, and we think we should do that by getting a guardian. So in this particular situation, I'd love to draw it out and have you say what you think ought to happen. But in this particular situation, we opted for family mediation. We opted for a discussion with Pearl herself that basically said, look, all these kids are worried about you. And in her inimitable way, she said, they've always been worried about me. I've lived my life. This is my money. Everybody leave me alone. But it was very clear that what was different now in her 70s after this stroke is that as much as she might want to be able to bounce back from every episode of exploitation, it wasn't just that she was going to run out of money. She was also going to be running out of time. And so it seemed that a middle road might be that she agreed to park some of her assets somewhere else that would be used just for her if she managed to live to a riper old age than she already was, and for her to be able to spend the rest of her money as she wished. And that eventually was the compromise that we worked, which was even frankly a little better than a financial conservator, which had been another starting point, somebody who would manage her funds. She was having none of it. But a middle ground worked just fine. I think, in fact, that she appreciated not the control, but the concern that her children had. And so she lived happily ever after for a couple more years, but not any longer than that, and never ran out of money. But this was a situation in which she was exercising poor judgment. There was a wish to protect her without taking control. And this is what I mean about finding that balance. I think a judge could have declared her incompetent because she did have some pretty low scores on her many mental status exam. And some judges aren't very sophisticated, frankly. They look at a score, they look at a stroke, they look at an older woman, and they say, yeah, that makes sense, doctor. And there was a doctor willing to support that affidavit. So I think that she could have easily gotten a guardian, and she could have easily, I think she could have easily gotten a guardian. And I think that a financial conservator would have been the next best thing, but I was really glad that the family agreed to mediation and that collectively, with her involved also, we were able to find an alternative. Someone asked the question earlier, well, what's the difference between being a caregiver and a guardian? So a guardian is somebody who is appointed by the court, okay? To have a guardian, the court appoints you, and a guardian has full decision-making control over all areas of a person's life. In contrast to a caregiver, who is somebody, sometimes a family member, sometimes a friend, sometimes a paid professional, who actually looks after you, gives care, makes some decisions on your behalf, perhaps in a day-to-day way, but most caregivers don't take over long-range planning or long-term decision-making unless the person they're caring for has given them that authority. And so this middle ground that can be found often does take the guise of a financial conservator. Look, mom, you're doing great in every area of your life, but look what's happened to your finances. This is just something that's hard for you to do. Would you allow me to help you with that, to balance your checkbook, to look after your money, whatever it is? And we all know of exploited situations where less than trustworthy adult children have persuaded a parent to let them put their name on their bank account and have cleared it out. So bad things happen. There's no denying that. And there's no simple answer to this need to sometimes provide both protection and full throttle autonomy. So a middle ground, as I say, is an individual retains some authority, but not all. And each state has sort of different language for this. I think Maine uses the language of financial conservator. And then you have the least restrictive support plan, in which a person retains full independence, full decision-making power, but they might agree to certain things like automatic deposit into their bank, right? Social Security check goes right in and the rent comes directly out. So the person doesn't have to sort of bother with that anymore. Same way with auto pay on all of their utilities. And this is a strategy that is often used for people living in the community who are living with dementia, who in fact have gotten to that edge where they're at risk of losing their homes or getting kicked out of their apartment, or they've failed to pay their utility bills and their electric's being turned off. If the person realizes that without any court involvement, they can agree to have certain things done automatically and they can stop it at any time and they can manage it, it's another really great strategy for protection and autonomy, getting some of those voluntary things. Can a person leave his fortune to cats? Even if he has a ne'er-do-well son or daughter? The answer to this question is yes, if somebody has done a testamentary capacity in which the person says, look, I know in the usual course of things I should be leaving this to my ne'er-do-well son, but my ne'er-do-well son has never brought me the joy and comfort that my cats have brought, and ergo, I am leaving my fortune. Yes, I know that I'm worth over $5 million, but I am leaving it to found a sanctuary for stray cats. If a person does all that, the courts can't stop it, nor can that ne'er-do-well son, because they have met the judgment of who's your heir and what are you worth. So that's how you win. If you have if you have a big fortune and you want to do something that your kids might not like, make sure that somebody does your testamentary capacity exam as you are writing your will, meet the 2 criteria, and you can leave it wherever you want. Okay, here are your takeaways. Capacity is task specific, it's situational, functions more important than diagnosis. Guardianships are not benign. Avoid them if you can. Respect autonomy, and that's even true for people living with dementia.